Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. You guys, I am struggling to not get ahead of myself with these episodes of The Boys. I really almost sat down on Halloween and watched episodes 7 and 8 back to back, because I haven't wanted to watch those yet without having done this episode. Really, I should have just done the episode earlier so that I could watch episodes 7 and 8. That might be working smarter instead of harder. But alas, I did not. So I've still not seen episodes 7 and 8, but hopefully I can watch it tonight, perhaps, after I finish this episode. I want to maintain the surprises and not get any of the information or spoilers out there in the episodes out of order by getting lost in the timeline via binging. Normally I do just binge through, but for this one I want to maintain some of the surprise so I can discuss it with you guys as I experience it. So this week we are going to talk about The Boys Season 2, Episode 6. We're going to talk about what happens when people are deprived of human connections, how that works amongst an entire spectrum. We're also going to talk about how perspectives change in general, those that we have of others and of ourselves, in addition to the perspectives that are different amongst people. So we're going to talk about amongst and between perspectives. Stick around to the end when we talk about Stormfront and Homelander's developing relationship. So, first up, there is a lot going on in this episode. I know I've said that about a lot of the episodes, but the one before this, people complained that they felt it was a little bit slow. I think it's really important to take the time to flesh out these stories. So we know little bits of information, like the fact that when Billy first went to put the boys back together in season 1, that MM and Frenchie were very mad at each other, and Grace Mallory was mad at Frenchie, but even more so at Billy, because her grandkids were targeted by Lamplighter and killed. And so this episode unexpectedly unpacks that story. And while there's a lot of information in the story, there's a lot of action in it, I really enjoyed that origin story unveiling for Frenchie. I didn't really see it coming at this point, but I like how The Boys kind of subverts our expectations. It's not just following everyone else's prescribed method of storytelling and looking for, the climax in the middle of it, and then the downfall of the action, the following of the action, and things like that. We have a bunch of different storylines going on, and they're rising and falling at different points and at different rates. And I think that is partly what keeps me so engaged in this show, and why I desperately want to binge it, and probably will as soon as I finish all of these episodes with you guys. But there's a lot of power in that origin story, and in getting the different perspectives. We already know from MM's perspective that Frenchie really let them down, and this really bothers MM because he has kids too. and he felt that he couldn't really trust his teammate in getting things done the way they were supposed to and in protecting the kids. So he was very upset about that. And Mallory is also angry, but more so with Billy, because Billy was the one in charge. And, Billy's also less likable than Frenchie. Let's be honest. Carl Urban is hot and everything, but this character is really, really abrasive. And that's something that I definitely love about Billy as a character. But if we had to hang out with either of them, I at least would choose to hang out with Frenchie. He seems like a really cool guy and much more emotionally stable and understanding and compassionate than Billy is. I mean, unless you're Becca, and then you would probably pick Billy. I don't know. We'll see. Becca didn't pick Billy the last 2 times she was given the option, but those were both choosing between him and Ryan. So that's a little bit different. It's a lot bit different. But we get to unpack that story with Frenchie, and I want to say that he's one of my favorite characters, but I love them all so much. They do a really great job in this show of covering these characters as an ensemble cast, and also getting to see a lot of their backstories. But also, a lot of their backstories are intertwined, because they have known each other for so long. So we might be getting some more origin stories and some more history for Frenchie as a person, but it also simultaneously tells us more about these other characters. And that's very different from a lot of shows like sci-fi shows, like Stargate SG-1. So we get to see Sam and Jack and Daniel and Teal'c coming together as a group in Children of the Gods parts 1 and 2. And if you watch the movie by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin, then you've already seen Jack and Daniel meet each other before. So we get to see firsthand how these relationships unfold. And sure, Daniel and Jack have a little bit more history than the rest of them share, but it's not all that much. And if you watch the movie, then you get to see them meet and that develop anyway, all from like 4 hours of television, really, or 4 hours of film footage. And then part of the fun is exploring that with them. But Stargate really hits its stride around season 4, at least for me. That's when we really know who these characters are, and they've nailed down who their primary directors and writers are, and people are really getting a sense of their characters too, and their relationships with each other. Jack is no longer the brusque Jack that we see at the beginning of the series, and, part of that was that transition that Richard Dean Anderson was trying to make from the Kurt Russell Jack O'Neill from the movie, who he thought was way too hard, and the Jack O'Neill that he thought would be best for the TV show, which is someone who is more irreverent and witty. And they did a great job in fleshing that out and us getting to see Jack heal from the death of his son. But Stargate also didn't go super in-depth outside of the actual action. We didn't get to see a lot of what the characters were like outside of the base or outside of the context of these different planets. And that's something that The Boys does really well without making it seem super weird, like it did sometimes in JAG, when, they get shot down by poachers on their day off flying and stuff. That show will go off the rails. And I loved it for that reason. I love all of these shows for different reasons. But for me, The Boys really does a fantastic job of using these flashbacks to tell some of these stories about these characters and their perspectives and why they are the way that they are now. It just adds a lot of different layers to the show. Like onion skins. Onions have layers like ogres. You guys know what I'm talking about. So for me, even though a lot of other people were like, why are there flashbacks in this episode? I thought that they were well-timed and well inserted into the storyline. You can't just go, oh, hey, it's the climax, and so no flashbacks are allowed at all. Well, if that's part of the climax is explaining why things are the way that they are, then yeah, you need to put it there. Where else would you put that flashback? Where and how else would you introduce that concept? I think getting to see the different perspectives of Frenchie and Lamplighter and MM and Billy and Grace Mallory in this situation really add a lot of depth and quality to these characters and to the show in general in terms of their writing. They did a really great job telling this without just being straight up expositional. It was told through the human emotions and interactions between these characters rather than just going, hey, you killed that guy that one time and I'm mad about it. So in that way, I think that they've done a masterful job in how they've decided to construct and tell this story. So I don't think that they really lost momentum or picked up too fast for this one. I don't think that it's weird that they did a lot of heavy backstory this far into the season, considering the season's only 8 episodes. I disagree with most other people for that. I don't think it has to follow this prescribed plot line anymore, or this plot structure, especially since we are moving into a very different era of storytelling with these types of Netflix bingings and things of that nature. So I'm all here for it. I know a lot of people hate the flashbacks. I like them. I'm a big fan of them in this show and in Star Trek Picard. So, there is a lot going on in this episode, though. Aside from Frenchie's origin story, which we will cover here in a little bit, we also see that there's more information coming out of Queen Maeve. Now that she has told Elena what has happened with Homelander and that Homelander is dangerous, Elena's realizing more and more about Maeve, and it's not quite like a dam has burst, because Maeve's still Maeve. She's not just spilling all the beans, but Maeve has made a decision about how to move forward. And there's also some really great scenes with Billy and Annie. These two people are really important to Huey in very different ways. I'm not sure if Billy is like an older brother or an uncle or a father figure for Huey. Billy is both antagonist and protagonist and agonist. Like, Billy's all over the place. And that's something that's fun about Billy, because it gives him a lot of range in the choices of where to take the character. And Annie also feels some type of way about Billy, seeing as he shot her a while back, but he also did that to save Huey. And so he begrudgingly has somewhat of Annie's respect, even if it's not quite affection. But they are finding their common ground in Huey. So there's not a lot of momentum lost, and there is a lot of story going on in this episode, both in the present day and in the past. But most of the activity in this episode takes place at this place called Sage Grove. So when Annie was snooping in Stormfront's laptop in her trailer, she found some emails about a place called Sage Grove. And they don't know much about it, except that Stormfront is fooling around with it, and Annie opened a couple of emails, I think, before Stormfront came in and found her. But Billy, Huey, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, Kimiko, and Annie all decide to go to Sage Grove. They want to know what's going on with Stormfront and Vought. They already know that Stormfront is Liberty and that she is a bad guy and she is very, very racist. They know that she has some kind of terrible agenda. They also know that Vought is somehow also involved. And now Annie has been directly threatened by Stormfront too. She's told her that she's going to be very useful, and all Stormfront could get out, or all Annie could get out is, what does that mean when Homelander walked in and interrupted them, and they both pretended like nothing was happening. because it doesn't serve either of their agendas to tell Homelander, even if Stormfront and Homelander are now somewhat of a very toxic item. So Stormfront's not being entirely open and honest with Homelander, so that makes me feel like she's definitely just using him. I don't think that she has any true affection for him in any way, but I'm also open to being pleasantly surprised with how that plot diverges. The Boys is really great about subverting our expectations, so we'll see how complex that relationship gets, and we'll talk about that at the end of our final segment. Right now, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what the boys and Annie find out at Sage Grove. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the plot structure and flow for this episode. How a lot of people did not love it. There's a lot of flashbacks and fleshing out of origin stories, but I'm here for it. And I don't think it's that weird to put it in episode 6 when there are only 8 episodes. But I still haven't seen 7 and 8, so we'll revisit that when I've seen it. And we do those podcast episodes. One thing I do want to mention that I forgot to mention in the episode 5 coverage was the bi-erasure. And yes, that is supremely ironic that I also accidentally erased Queen Maeve's bisexuality when they were pointing out bi-erasure on the show. So it was in my notes, but I missed it because I needed to finish really quickly last time. But I wanted to cover it now. So, remember we had in the last episode Elena and Maeve coming to a head because the Vought folks have found out that Maeve is in a relationship with a woman and has been before. And Homelander was incensed when he found out and outed her and demanded that that be put into the storyline. So he's doing his utmost to humiliate her. And when they start drawing Elena into it, Maeve is so used to having to do all of this crap that she hates that she doesn't really fight it much. But Elena outright balks because they tell her she needs to cut her hair and wear pantsuits to conform to their concept and the cultural concept of what someone who is gay or who is a lesbian should look like, and how there are people out there in the United States who are more comfortable with a lesbian relationship and the optics of it if there is clearly one person who seems to fill more of a masculine role and one who seems to form more of a feminine role. Society in general doesn't seem to be comfortable with lipstick lesbians, as they're sometimes referred to as being both very feminine lesbians, or in a couple of lesbians being more butch. So they want them to be more dichotomous in that way. And that doesn't work for Elena. That's not who she is as a person, and she's not a public figure. She has her own separate life from this, and Maeve has just re-entered it recently. And this is very foreign to her, because Maeve so desperately kept Elena apart from Vought and Homelander when she was with Elena before to protect her, that this is just very jarring for Elena. Even though she's known Maeve for a very long time and been close to her, being close to Maeve is different from being close to a lot of other people. It means something different, both in her emotional responses and how much she shares, but also in her public versus private life. So since Elena has been separated from this, she's very upset by it. And she gets even more upset on Maeve's behalf when Ashley and the PR guys keep referring to Maeve as being a lesbian. And Elena stops them really curtly and is like, you know she's bisexual, right? Like, she's not a lesbian. She is bisexual. Yes, she also likes women, but she also likes people of other genders as well. So that isn't really something that you should be calling her. And of course, Ashley and the others brush it aside and say that, you know, culturally it's easier for people to understand one or the other. And we talked about the dichotomy of like binary opposites and also the use of binary mediators before, and how it's difficult for people to understand things in between. It's easier for people to understand homosexual or heterosexual than it is bisexual or pansexual. What is a sleeper sofa? It's where bisexuals sleep, as my cultural anthropology professor explained to us. It's somewhere between a bed and a couch, but which one is it more of or the other? Does it have to be? Can it be half and half? Does that even matter? And we ask a lot of those same things about bisexuality. And being bisexual or pansexual is often erased by a lot of language use. And people dismiss it. People also tend to think that bisexual people are more prone to cheating or are more prone to wanting to have threesomes or have non-monogamous relationships than other people. It can be very problematic, and it often results in a hypersexualization of bisexual individuals, while at the same time almost denying that they exist at all. People prefer to think of it as being a phase, or saying, hey, you know, you're really a lesbian. You just, you know, are with a guy right now, like you'll come back around. Things like that. Or people talking about being gold star lesbians. So a lesbian who's never been with a man at all. And thereby creating a hierarchy in terms of attraction and physical expressions of love or sexual desire in general. And it's very meta the way that they approach it, with Elena outright saying it in indignation on behalf of Maeve, who has experienced it so much now that she's really unfazed for the most part. She just wants to get this done. She wants the information so they can get this over with and she can put it behind her. But Elena loves her, and so she's standing up for her. And Ashley just commits more acts of bi-erasure in her response to Elena's indignation. She doesn't even treat it very seriously. And that's how a lot of folks feel about identity in the modern culture in America. So there were just layers of bi-erasure in that scene, and I thought it was very important to talk about it. So I wanted to cover that before I moved on. It was in my notes to bring up with you guys. If you saw that episode and that scene and you thought, dude, hard same, in that you are also experiencing bi-erasure, you have experiences you'd like to share, I would also love to hear from you guys about those on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Now we're going to return to talking about this episode, episode 6. So, as we covered, Stormfront has been talking to some group called Sage Grove. It's a facility out there somewhere that her mom's at, and she's been visiting. At least that's what they think. And so the boys, the whole gang of them, go to see what's going on there. They kind of just show up at Sage Grove and they're like, hey, we're going to sneak in and get some info on this. What is Vought doing now? What is Stormfront actually doing? And how long has she been doing this? Since she's been alive for a crazy amount of time. So they find that it's pretty much a testing facility for super terrorists. So they're injecting mental patients with Compound V and then seeing what happens. It is really dark and messed up. It reminds you a lot of Nazi hospital experiments and experiments people have done on who were considered to be the criminally insane at a certain point in history. Also experiments that were performed on people of color, and in particular, female people of color over the years too. So a lot of medical experiments have been performed on vulnerable populations over the years within the US and throughout the world. And this is really what Stormfront is doing. She is, in effect, a Nazi. And she, as a neo-Nazi, is doing this experimentation that's very similar to what folks did in World War II. And we find out later in this episode that she's been around since before World War II and literally danced with Himmler. She sounds like she's German when she uses that accent. Like she's straight up German and has accommodated to an American accent over the years to become more appealing. But that she's continuing essentially Nazi type experiments on humans. And it's easiest to do this on people who no one tests or no one comes to check on at all. No one comes to visit these people because they are locked up in a mental institution for the rest of their lives. They're either dark secrets for their families, or it's just something people don't want to face. So they don't have to worry about folks coming to check on them. So they just keep doing these experiments on them, injecting them with Compound V. Now that they know they don't have to do it to babies, they can do it to grown adults and see what happens. That's what she's doing. And it turns out that she's not doing this alone. So Stormfront seems to be like the director of this facility. She comes and checks it out a fair amount, but she's not the one really running it, really doing most of the work in the meantime. That's actually being performed by Lamplighter. Now, we thought Lamplighter was gone for the longest time. He killed Grace Mallory's kids, and then we never really saw Lamplighter again. But it turns out that Lamplighter, played by Shawn Ashmore, who also played Bobby/Iceman in some of the X-Men films, has been helping her out and essentially working as her nurse, I suppose, doing the day-to-day work with these patients. Now, there are other people in the facility as well who are, working the security cams. Most of these people are dressed in scrubs, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of them. There doesn't seem to be very good care going on for these people. They seem to be fed, but other than that, they're just living their lives in these padded rooms and being experimented upon to see what kinds of random powers that they get, or I suppose maybe even if the powers are random. I assume she's trying to get enough variables to see what all is possible, and also whether the possible could be predictable, and therefore be something that she could weaponize. So, Lamplighter is her nurse, I guess, and if the patients don't do what she wants them to do, then she has Lamplighter torch them. It's very, very grim. But we do get to learn a lot more about Lamplighter in this episode too. And we learn why he might have hated the boys, why he might have wanted vengeance on Grace Mallory. And it turns out that Mallory and the boys blackmailed him way back in the day into reporting about what happened with the Seven at Vought. So right now the boys have Annie, who is willingly telling them all this information. And I'm sure if they were even, kind of nice to the Deep, they could probably win him over too. Lord knows that man joined a cult because he needed love and affection and some healing and personal growth. So if you're nice to him, he's probably going to come around real easy. But they're not nice to him, so they just have Annie. But before they had anyone on the inside, they thought that it would be best to blackmail Lamplighter rather than try to win them over. So they did. And one night, while Frenchie was supposed to be watching him, he followed Lamplighter to a club and then had to leave for a little bit. And that's what resulted in Mallory's kids being torched. Frenchie was supposed to be tailing him and keeping an eye on him, and he was only gone for about 30 minutes or so. But in that 30-minute span of time, Lamplighter ended up killing those children as they slept at Grace Mallory's house. So that was also even more upsetting to her that they were killed in her own home. I can imagine that that felt incredibly violating in addition to making her heart sick, because that would also make her feel more culpable for it too, because she wasn't able to stop it in her own home. So they have some beef, and because of that, Frenchie is really upset, in particular to see Lamplighter, and Kimiko is really upset when Stormfront shows up. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about what happens when these characters all encounter each other at this facility. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the discoveries at Sage Grove, including the fact that Stormfront is experimenting on people who have cognitive and mental issues. So they're locked up in a facility called Sage Grove, and she is injecting them with Compound V to see what happens. It draws a lot of parallels to Nazi experiments, and we find out that Stormfront herself may well be a Nazi, and not necessarily a neo-Nazi, but rather an ancient one. Ancient might be a little bit of a stretch, as World War II was in the 1940s, but that's still over 80 years ago, and she was already a grown adult by that time. So she's fairly old. But now that the boys have discovered this facility and some of them have snuck in, we see that there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot more than meets the eye. We see Lamplighter, and it's been like 10 years, perhaps, since they've seen Lamplighter, but he's still just as young as he was before. Now remember, soups are made, not born in The Boys, and so we have only seen the ones that are between Homelander and Annie's age. It's a relatively new development in medical history. So we don't really know how old people can get, and that's why it's a little bit jarring for them to see Lamplighter looking as though nothing has changed, and it provides us some more context for Stormfront. Now, these characters haven't seen each other in a long time, but while they are in this facility, Lamplighter and the others end up having an altercation because some folks aren't paying good attention, and there is a breakout in Sage Grove. Think kind of like Arkham Asylum, and how this would perhaps be really bad news bears. So these folks aren't prepared to live with these powers. They were in there because there was something going on that made them emotionally or mentally disturbed, ostensibly, as far as we can tell. And that's how they got there to begin with. So perhaps giving them powers was not really the best idea. But Stormfront didn't really think of it as giving them powers, but rather as them being experiments. They're like mice to her that she is experimenting on biologically. So she didn't really think about what they would do with those powers. She's more concerned about what she can do by being in charge of people who have these powers. But before any of them can really be indoctrinated or we can get very far into this process, they do have a breakout. And there is a character who is able to explode people's heads by looking over at them, which is what happened to Susan. So now we know that that's probably not Stormfront's power, but is more likely to be the power of one of these characters who were in this mental institution. So that's giving us a big idea of what she's doing. She's not only probably creating them there, but also taking them out on missions to see how effective some of them can be, and to see whether or not they can be controlled. But ultimately, she's playing with fire, in my opinion, and this could very much go poorly for her. But the person who is able to explode people's heads ends up escaping, and so does someone who has telekinesis. They're able to flip the van outside that Huey is in, and Annie and Billy are standing nearby. So Huey gets a big piece of metal that's twisted all up in his gut, and Annie and Billy now have this common ground with each other. So they have a mutual concern, and it's helping them to overcome some of their issues with Huey and also their issues with each other by facing this crisis together. And nothing brings people together like a crisis. Now, on the other hand, while that's happening, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, and Kimiko are locked in a room with Lamplighter, who is having a standoff with them. Frenchie wants to kill him right now, but Lamplighter also very well may torch them. He has a lighter with him that he has been using to initiate the fire that he needs to burn other people with whenever Stormfront tells him to. So he is prepared to defend himself too, and we're a little concerned because Mother's Milk and Frenchie don't have any powers or healing abilities. Kimiko does, however. So they use that to their advantage. And while they're trying to convince him to team up to get out of there, he gets attacked, and Kimiko dispatches of that person. We get to see a lot of weird and interesting random powers in this episode. I won't spoil it for you if you haven't seen it yet, but there is one patient who chokes one of the characters, and it's pretty hilarious how that happens. Think Reed Richards in a way, but dark and weird. Like fan fiction, Reed Richards probably. I've never read any Fantastic Four fanfics, but I mean, think about it for a second and you'll get where I'm going with it. It's pretty hilarious and just also jarring. It's a reminder that they really have no idea what is going to happen when they give people Compound V. It's not really predictable. The Deep grew gills because he was injected as a child, but it's also modified some of these people ostensibly as adults. I don't think that person has been incarcerated in this facility at Sage Grove for that long, like since they were a kid. But I could be wrong. Stormfront is old enough that she could have been getting people assigned to a facility for the criminally insane before we stopped referring to people as being criminally insane. There's a strong possibility that a lot of people have been in there for a long time. We don't know enough about it yet. But everything's gone sideways. We're going to see a lot of cool and weird new powers and getting an idea of the breadth of what could truly be happening. Not everything seems to be super helpful necessarily, but a lot of these powers do have strong destructive potential. And now a lot of these folks are loose. So this also forces Lamplighter to team up with Mother's Milk, Frenchie, and Kimiko to find a way out, although they are also essentially holding him hostage / at gunpoint. He's being threatened this whole time too. Now, these people are being roughly dispatched or avoided, or they're escaping by the time Stormfront arrives. She's missed most of the action, but MM and Frenchie and Kimiko are panicked because they know that if Lamplighter shouts out for her, that there's going to be a problem. They're not going to likely survive this. Kimiko would love a reason to go ahead and fight Stormfront. She wants to take her out for killing her brother, but MM and Frenchie need her to stay calm. And Kimiko, even though she's very angry, she has a good rein on those emotions, and she really withholds herself from doing so. And in a surprise move, Lamplighter does not tell Stormfront that the others are there. He walks out in the hallway to speak with her for a moment, and then she leaves again, and everyone is still safe. The boys and Lamplighter, that is. And we're kind of starting to see that Lamplighter might not be as bad of a guy as we initially thought he was. Now, that said, his reasons for killing Mallory's grandkids and him working at a Nazi facility, those are very different things. He is still working at a Nazi facility, though, so doesn't mean he's really a great guy either. Even if he appears to be coerced by Stormfront, it looks like Lamplighter is often under the thumb of someone more powerful than him in some way, whether that means working for Homelander or reporting on the Seven to Grace Mallory and the boys because they have the leverage of knowledge over him, even if they're not more powerful, and definitely Stormfront having immense power at her disposal, both in the form of her superpowers and her deep, deep connections with Vought. Even if he's still a bad guy and he's done some bad things, they did a really great job in writing this episode and directing it, and Sean Ashmore and acting this out to make you feel like maybe there is a different perspective here too. And that's how we find out that Lamplighter actually didn't mean to kill Grace Mallory's kids, or her grandkids. So he did go that night that Frenchie was supposed to be watching him and torched the children. But he didn't know that that's who was in the bed. The bed that he torched was actually Grace Mallory's, and he thought that she was the one sleeping in the bed. He killed her to try to get out from under her thumb because he was scared about where that left him in relation to Homelander, the person that most people seem to fear above all others. And so he went to end this blackmail that was occurring, and he torched her in her bed because that's his power, is torching people. So he's a lot like Pyro, funnily enough, from X-Men, even though he played Bobby. And Lamplighter seems to be genuinely distraught at having killed these children. It turns out that even though he was with Vought and one of the Seven, and he did kill Mallory's kids and intended to kill Mallory, he wasn't meaning to do anything that heinous. Unlike Homelander, he draws a line at harming kids. and he seems to be horrified and tortured every day, mentally and emotionally, by the fact that he killed those kids. And the flame that he throws is so hot that they were already burning beyond saving and screaming by the time that he realized that those screams were not coming from Grace Mallory, but rather from her grandchildren who were lying beneath the covers. So it makes him somewhat of a sympathetic character in that regard. It at the very least provides him with a lot more depth, and it shows us that everything is not always as it seems, and that our own personal biases can very much color the way we view history and personal events in our lives. If they didn't already hate Soups and the Seven, then they might not necessarily have blackmailed Lamplighter in particular, just choosing him as the weakest link, and then forcing his hand into trying to rid himself of the blackmail. So who knows how this could have played out differently, but I really, really love the layers to this, and finding out that one of the most heinous villains of the show, who killed these children, who tortured them by burning them alive, didn't actually intend to kill the children, and is not only has he accidentally done it like A-Train, who doesn't really care that he's killed Robin, he laughs about it and is callous, but he accidentally killed these children, and he is distraught and tortured every day by what he's done. Shawn Ashmore just brings a certain amount of misery to his eyes and his facial expressions that make you really feel like this man has seen some stuff and he's done some things that he's really not proud of. A lot like Maeve, but perhaps to an even deeper level, because at least Maeve was forced to do that by Homelander, whereas Lamplighter made this mistake all on his own. It is a beautiful weaving of these narrative threads, and I really enjoyed the different perspective that it brought. I did not see that coming, and I appreciate that a lot about this show. We also get to know more about Frenchie in this, as the only reason Frenchie was absent for those 30 minutes was that his friend OD'd, and his girl at the time, Cherie, called him over to go and help save that guy. I think that they might have all been paramours, Frenchie, Cherie, and his friend who OD'd. I'm not sure. I got somewhat of a sense that they were all lovers together, but I'm not sure if Frenchie was also with that guy or if Cherie just had two boyfriends. I don't know the nature of the relationship, but that's kind of the sense that I got, that they weren't just friends. But I digress. The point is that that person OD'd, and he had to go and try to save this person who was very important to him. He had tracked Lamplighter to a club, and he thought that he would be able to quickly go and help his friend and come back. But he was gone for only 30 minutes, and in that amount of time, Lamplighter was able to leave and kill those children. So now the guilt that Frenchie has felt this entire time, it also allows him to somewhat understand Lamplighter's perspective on this. He believes Lamplighter when he says that he didn't mean to kill the kids and that he's upset by it. And Frenchie seems to see some type of kinship between the specific mistakes that they each made that night and how things turned out the way that they did. And now that they're able to piece more of these perspectives together, Frenchie surprisingly tries to stop Grace Mallory from killing Lamplighter. They're all still very upset, but it's a broad examination of humanity and our mistakes. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up with the Church of the Collective and also where Homelander is with Stormfront. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the events that go down in Sage Grove, including the facility breakout. I'm not quite sure if it's an asylum or what exactly it's supposed to be. It looks like an asylum on the inside, but from the outside, it sounds more like an assisted living facility. So I'm not quite sure. It's somewhere between those two. But we get to know a lot about Lamplighter and Frenchie, and we get a missing piece to the puzzle. And I enjoy that a lot about this show, because often villains are very limited in their storytelling. We just go, okay, yeah, they're bad, and we just accept that they're supposed to be bad, that there are many reasons someone could be bad, and we just roll with it. But The Boys adds a lot more depth to that discussion. And we're also getting to see more breadth in the narrative because of it. We see not only Mallory's experience and perspective and MM being mad at Frenchie for it, but now MM coming around to understanding that Frenchie had to make a very difficult choice. And it just so happened to coincide with this very small window of time that Lamplighter also made a terrible mistake. So it's shifting these characters' perspectives too, and also their relationships. This is removing a barrier of sorts between MM and Frenchie in their friendship and their brotherhood. They've been working together lately despite being mad enough at each other to literally come to blows, because Frenchie's been holding the secret about where he was that night. He was just taking the guilt and the beating because he felt that was owed to him, because he felt he had allowed those kids to die. And now that he knows that Lamplighter didn't even mean to, it recontextualizes it a bit for everyone. I think it'll take Mallory the longest to recontextualize it, but that makes sense because she was the closest to it, and that proximity is blinding. And by the closest to it, I do mean that emotionally. So this is a very well done action episode. We also see Annie and Billy working together to save Huey's life and getting to learn more about Annie's powers. It turns out that Annie is really required to suck power from around her. She needs the presence of energy already in order to discharge it as those light bursts, as starlight. Very similar to how Lamplighter needs that light or that fire already initiated before he can go ahead and use his powers. He can move the fire wherever he wants it to go and amplify it, but he cannot generate a spark himself, and neither can Annie. So that raises a lot of questions like, where does A-Train's power derive from? Is that metabolic in nature? What specifically does that feed off of? Or what fuels Homelander's laser eyes? We may not learn that one. And perhaps some people have these innate powers and others have maybe weaker associations and have to rely upon, drawing upon these other power sources, that energy can't be created or destroyed. And so they have to get that resource from somewhere. But that also makes me wonder, about where the laser energy and stuff's coming from. I digress. I'm trying to make my sci-fi too sciencey again. But I did find that to be very interesting, that they underline that for both Annie and for Lamplighter in this episode. Ostensibly, both of them were created as babies like this, since the Deep has had these gills his entire life, and Lamplighter was one of the 7, but a relatively new one. He's not as young as Annie, but he's probably about Maeve's age, or perhaps younger than that, roughly about A-Train's age, I would say. I think they were all on there together. So we're learning a lot in this episode about the aging of these soups, also their motivations, and the mechanics of it. So how this works in drawing power. So Annie does have some healing power with this light, but she can't cauterize the wound that Huey has without drawing more power. Because when the person telekinetically blasted the van, it seems that somewhere in the chaos and fighting an EM pulse was emitted by one of the characters. And so that's wiped out all the power around it. This electromagnetic pulse has destroyed the power in the area. Very similar to the premise of Dark Angel. So since there's no power for her to draw upon, they have to go and kind of carry Huey and just trust that the others are going to be able to get out on their own and go and pretty much hijack a car. So they get the nearest person they can to pull over because, of course, Sage Grove is kind of in the middle of nowhere. You want to do your secret, terrible experiments on people where other folks aren't going to find out about it. And that includes its location, location, location. So they're out in the middle of nowhere, and they get a guy to pull over. And this is a big point where Annie realizes in this episode that she's becoming more like Billy. She is prioritizing the lives of the people she loves over the lives of everyone else, simply because they are special to her. Like in the book The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I'm probably butchering his name. You guys know I don't speak French. But that book / movie, it's been made into a movie a couple times, talks about how we come to think of things as being ours, how we develop affection for other things, whether they be plants or animals. So in the story, the little boy and the fox kind of tame each other, and the fox says that now he is important because he is different from all the other foxes to the little boy, and that little boy is different to him than all of the other little boys. And so they have an affection for each other through familiarity. And now that makes them more important than the abstract concept of all the other foxes or little boys out there in the world. And just like that, Annie is seeing that, like how Billy will do anything it takes to save Becca, Annie is doing everything she can to save Huey. And she ends up accidentally killing a man in the process. And she's very upset at Billy for this too, because she feels that she had to discharge her powers to get that guy away from them because he was drawing a gun on them, because Billy made the encounter more aggressive than he needed to be. And that ultimately she's upset because she's still responsible for her own actions and for deciding when to act. And that she might have gone a little bit overboard with that blast in her panic. But there's nothing else that she can do. She can only sit there and think about how similar she now is to the man in this car with her, as she sucks the power from the battery and goes ahead and saves Huey. We also have a weird subplot still of the Church of the Collective. So remember, the Deep joined a cult, and so he kind of did that pretty quickly, and then we just get told secondhand that he is getting married now, which is interesting because that's kind of how things work in real life. A character does something bad, they acknowledge it and apologize, and then they disappear for a while, and then they come back having reinvented themselves in a way. That action component. So this is exactly what Ashley and the others were talking about for PR in the previous episode. acknowledgement, apology, action. So a lot of times they disappear for a while and they say they're at rehab or wherever else. And then when they decide it's safe to rehabilitate, you suddenly start hearing about them again when you haven't heard about them in a long time. That's all that they're really doing. And I like that they are both doing and showing this process, again, being very meta. In some ways, I would have liked to have seen more development with the Church of the Collective as we've gone along, but I imagine we'll do a deep dive via flashbacks or something in season 3 to learn more about that. I am very excited, though, that Goran Viznik is the leader of the Church of the Collective. I really enjoy him as an actor. He was really great on ER. I know it's not sci-fi, but if you guys ever watched ER, he was awesome on it. He's one of my favorite characters. And he is a fantastic actor. So I'm really stoked to see him and how they develop his character out. But this seemed a little bit, it came off a little bit out of nowhere to me. I wasn't ready to meet the Church of the Collective leader, or I wasn't expecting to. But again, when does the boys ever do what we expect them to do? Unless it's gory. You can always say the goriest outcome, but you can't really narrow down exactly what that's going to mean at any given point. So this Church of the Collective started out as being like Scientology, and now we're in kind of a nebulous place with it. And A-Train kind of stumbles into this subplot too. So he's about to be replaced in the 7. And so the Deep decides, hey, this person is vulnerable. I'm gonna help you be even better than you were before, and with the Church of the Collective and all of our help, we can get you back in too. I'm about to get back in. I'm working on my PR and they can help you too. And it felt like a new direction for the Deep at first, but now it feels more like, I don't know, it feels a little bit more underhanded, but also like he's very stupid. I'm not sure if that's how I'm supposed to feel about him. I feel like he's very naive because he is believing in this stuff himself, but I mean, that's how cults get in there. They recognize a vulnerability and they exploit it by making you feel heard and understood, and like they're the only ones who hear and understand you and see you for who you are. It's partly about embracing you into the fold. And it still feels a little underdeveloped right now, but I'm excited to see where they take that in season 3. I think if we hold on, that we're going to get to know a lot more about the Church of the Collective and also about the Deep and A-Train and their place in this in season 3, but also about Goran Viznik. So lastly, I want to talk about Homelander in our final minutes. He is with Stormfront now. It's very toxic, especially for them. I was going to say even for them, but I don't know, it's just super toxic. In fact, double toxic? I'm not sure what to call it yet. But he still does not know that Maeve has access to the footage of the plane that went down last season. Maeve is working with the Deep and told him she'll support him coming back if he will help her out. And the Deep was able to get her footage of the plane that went down that Homelander wouldn't let her save anyone from because it would have been bad PR, even if they could have saved a few lives. For him, the bad press wasn't worth saving a couple of lives. And it exposes him for who he is. Unfortunately, Elena also sees it and is very upset. She understands that Maeve has been witness to and has also participated in war crimes. She doesn't know maybe exactly what Maeve's had to do, but she knows that Maeve herself is horrified at the things that Homelander has made her do. And she's horrified with herself that she has gone along with it for so long before deciding to push back. Now, Homelander, on the other hand, is regressing back to that needy, whiny self that he is when we saw him with Madeline Stillwell. He's demanding, he is very clingy too, and overall immature because he didn't have a human connection growing up, and that lack of a connection is something he wants to repair. Not like the connection is something he craves because he's never had it. And so he goes way overboard with it. It's one of my favorite plot lines in this story, and it's showing like a Captain America figure who just thrives on positive affirmation. And if you're not getting that affirmation, then that character feels totally bereft, but also angry, indignant, and arrogant about their right to it. So this isn't something they just enjoy, and it's not something he's doing for the right reasons. Like Cap does things because he believes they're right, even when it means going up against his friends, like Tony Stark in Civil War. Homelander rather just wants the praise because he didn't really get that growing up. He didn't get affection. He was attention starved and affection starved. So he needs that. And when people around him don't want to give him what he wants, then he lashes out. So it's no surprise that Homelander is a jealous boyfriend. We also know from some of the comments that Maeve made before that he was certainly a jealous boyfriend and that he was very dangerous, that he hurt a guy because the guy flirted with Maeve one time at an awards banquet. Like, for Homelander, his triggers are hairpin, and they are many. So it's not shocking at all that he tries to do the same thing to Stormfront. But Stormfront is less afraid of him, and she can handle him. I think that part of her play with him in the last episode with having him laser her chest was also to see how much of it she could take. What are her limits? How much can he really harm her? And because she is experimenting with that, she has this data. It makes him think of her as being perfect and like his equal and his mate. But I think that she's also just evaluating the weaknesses of who she considers to be her primary foe. This is the person everyone else is afraid of. So she needs to know what those weaknesses are and how strong she is compared against him in order to really take over from him. She knows that he is declining in the polls, and she knows exactly how to fix that. She is playing a game way above his level. It is past even Margaery and Joffrey. It might be Margaery and Tommen, for all that Homelander seems to be aware of this. Joffrey was at least somewhat suspicious some of the time. Homelander, for the most part, is pretty much just #handled by Stormfront. So we're learning a lot about these characters, and Stormfront had told Homelander she was going to go to Vought, and she lied about it. That's when she went to Sage Grove. So he was really upset she wasn't where she said she was going to be. He went to Vought and she wasn't there, and he loses it in his trailer when she doesn't come home when he expected her to, which is a red flag to begin with. But it seems like she really knows how to handle these people. She's played this Game of Thrones, more or less, and she knows how to calm down toxic people who have power trips. So she tells him exactly what he needs to hear. And she's like, you know what? I'm never going to lie to you again. Let me come clean about this secret that I have. You can't tell anybody else. Like, this is between you and me. Secret keeping is something that abusers and predators often use to establish rapport and groom someone that they are trying to bring to their side, or they're trying to get under their thumb. They build that relationship until they feel that that's the only person they can trust. And that's what I'm seeing, in my opinion, happening here. Is she reveals to Homelander not where she was, and nothing about Sage Grove, but just the fact that she was born in 1919, and she was the first superhero, and was injected by Frederick Vought, the founder of Vought himself. And so she is just pleased as heck that after a century, she has now found her perfect mate in Homelander, and that she feels invincible, and that he is her everything. She knows exactly what to say to him to get him right where she wants him. and that may be even more terrifying than Homelander himself. That's all I have for you guys today. I very much enjoyed breaking this episode down and looking at a whole bunch of the different holistic aspects we get to explore with the boys. And I am stoked to finish those up with episodes 7 and 8 in the next few weeks with you guys. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.